Video released by the Philippine military reveals a chaotic scene in the South China Sea. The Chinese Coast Guard is seen ramming and boarding inflatable Philippine Navy boats with bats, axes, and swords. The Philippine Navy was conducting a resupply mission for Filipino troops stationed in a disputed territory in the sea.
We think that it only happens when people start shooting at each other, and it's almost like a 100-yard dash. Where two contestants come up to the line, they shake loose, and then they get in the crouch, and the starter says, shoots the gun, go. And we think at that point, you're at war.
Yeah. Once the
shooting has started, and sometimes you even declare war. But it's when the shooting starts. And before that, we don't think there's war going on. We may not like each other that much, we may have problems, but it's not a war to an American way of thinking, a Western way of thinking, really. But to the Chinese, the shooting part is only the very end of it. And it's only if necessary. And if you've done everything right in the step leading up to that, you don't even have to do it, because your enemy is not in a position to defend himself and just kind of has to give up.
The question really is, we can talk about all the warfares, but what's the goal of all of the warfares, which is make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, and to replicate that model in a vassal state form. That's why, as Colonel Newsham was saying, you can't coexist with democracy. And the idea of winning is very different. You'll hear the term a lot, they want to win without fighting. But the actual translation from the original Mandarin is to get the other side to submit without fighting. Yeah. And submission is a permanent state. They're attacking us, we're at war, and if they win, our lives are permanently altered.
France, the cartel now reportedly working with Chinese snakehead gangs to smuggle Chinese nationals into the U.S., as encounters with illegal immigrants from China have skyrocketed over 4,000% since 2021.
When you talk about criminals coming from China, they absolutely are linked to the CCP for one specific reason, because of the banking system. They all use the Chinese state-controlled, in many cases state-owned banking system to be able to move the illicit money and illicit funds from their illicit activities. And so I think that it falls within the doctrine of what China calls unrestricted warfare, which they include criminal organizations as part of that warfare to attack the United States.
Welcome to the Border Wars podcast. We're the number one podcast in all of the Americas, the only bilingual podcast that takes you beyond the border. Now, obviously, I say we're the number one podcast, not because of me, but because of our guests. And we have two very special guests here to us today. I'm very privileged to be with both Cleo Paskal and Grant Newsham, both I consider very prominent Asia experts, or experts on the Indo-Pacific. And obviously, when it comes to the United States and national security and foreign policy, most of this conversation today is about China. We're going to get into that. But first of all, how are you guys doing? I'm glad you guys are here.
Good. It's great. It's great to be here, and I always learn from you. So it's a privilege to be with you. No,
privilege is mine. And Grant, you come from far away. I thought you were coming from Japan, but I think this time it's Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. Just Hawaii.
But you do you live in Japan?
I used to.
Okay, for a long time.
About 20 plus years, and I'm there a lot.
Well, we actually saw each other in Japan. I think it was a few months ago. Yeah. So let's begin a little bit for our audience to get a little bit to know more about your background and your experience. So we can start with Grant, actually, since you Ura, fellow Marine, Semper Fi, and also your time in Japan, which I think is very impressive. When I was in Japan, not only is Grant fluent in Japanese, not just the language, but the culture. I think your understanding of the nuances of the Japanese culture was very evident. And us gringos, as we say, come out there and we don't understand anything. We're kind of slipping up on each other. Explain a little bit about your time in Japan. I imagine part of that was with the military and part of it was out.
Sure. I went to Japan in the early 90s, actually, with the U.S. State Department.
Oh, okay.
So I was in the Foreign Service and was assigned to the embassy in Tokyo. And was supposed to be there for 4 years, and I ended up staying over 20.
Wow. All in the Foreign Service?
No, I actually sort of had enough of that. So I resigned and actually went to work for old Motorola.
Oh, okay.
If you remember that company.
Yes.
It actually went to China and committed suicide.
That's a good point.
I tried to tell them, but nobody listens to me. But and after that, I worked for an investment bank.
Okay.
In Tokyo, an American bank, and had a sort of a niche role, which was an interesting one. And it was largely to keep them out of trouble with Japanese organized crime.
Okay. The Yakuza, among others, yeah.
The Yakuza. And we were very successul at that. And because most companies don't realize that all you have to do is say no.
Wow.
And, which is, it's a sort of a quirk of Japanese culture, sort of Japanese society. And it's different than, say, the organized crime in the US or in China or Russia. But it's that's what comes of a liberal arts education, I think.
There you go.
But I was in Japan for a long time.
Yeah.
And
none of that time was with the Marine Corps?
Actually, it was. Because I was, like a lot of people, I started on active duty in the 80s, and it was peacetime, so it was boring. So you get out and do something else, and I went to work for the State Department.
Okay. Was this in Okinawa?
No, I was in Hawaii. Actually.
You were in Hawaii? Okay.
But and then I was always in the reserves after that.
Okay, yeah.
So whenever civilian work would get boring, you would go on active duty. And so I spent
Was that called ADSW? Special work?
Yeah, it could be. And, just a lot of it. So I would be in Okinawa and in Tokyo and go all over Asia for Marine Forces Pacific headquarters in Hawaii. But the last thing I did was for 3 years, I went on full-time active duty from 2011 to 2013 or so. And I and another Marine thought Japan needed an amphibious force. So we gave them one.
It's kind of a no-brainer.
Well, it is, but it was considered impossible.
Okay. Why is that?
It was considered warlike. Japan's supposedly pacifist. The Chinese would be angry if they did it. The Americans won't like it. But we didn't tell anybody. So we didn't ask permission. And we had some Japanese co-conspirators, in effect. And these were Japanese officials and military guys and some journalists who helped. And in very short order, Japan got an amphibious force.
So you stood up an amphibious force in secret?
Kind of. We didn't ask permission. But once you did, once it became successful, and it was obvious the Japanese you said, this is what we're going to do, then a lot of people started to take credit for it.
Of course.
Of course. Yeah. But if it had gone
wrong, then they would have blamed.
Maybe, but they probably would have. Yeah. But if we had asked permission, say, we would still be working on the PowerPoint slide deck a decade later. That's
bureaucracy at its finest.
So it worked pretty well. But anyway, that's, spent a long time in Asia, in Japan, with the Marines and in the private sector.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating. You had military experience, diplomatic experience, and obviously private sector experience and academic. And we're going to talk about your book in a second. But let me pivot now to Cleo. Because Cleo, you come...
How am I supposed to follow that?
Well, I don't think anyone could follow that, but we will do our best. And I think really, Cleo, you come from a different walk of life, journalism. You're a reporter. I think you still write reports and columns and articles for the Sunday Guardian in India.
Yep.
You also do contributions to different newspapers and media outlets here in the U.S. You're a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'm a big fan of FDD. I think you guys do awesome work. And then you're from Canada originally as well. So tell us a little about your journey, how you got into Asia in particular, and your work that you've done throughout the process.
Thank you. So I was a travel journalist for a long time.
Okay.
And what happens is you start to see patterns developing. So what I saw, especially in the early 2000s, was newly arrived Chinese fundamentally changing the characters of small island nations. It's much easier to see in a small island nation. The layers of populations are thinner, governance is thinner, they get overwhelmed more quickly.
Were you living in the Pacific Islands?
I was traveling pretty regularly as a travel journalist.
Okay, yeah.
So I was in, and it really started with Tonga. I was in Tonga around 2003, and then I went back 3 or 4 years later. And
working for the Sunday Guardian or another?
So I did a series on the world's smallest countries for the BBC.
Oh, very cool.
And
the world's smallest countries. Okay.
Yeah. Because I mean, that in itself is an interesting topic because they used to function quite differently, but now they're becoming very much front lines for the political warfare contestation that we're seeing, the battle between systems. And when I went back to Tonga after 3-4 years, newly arrived Chinese had taken over about 80% of the retail sector, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that they were bringing in modern PRC ways of doing things, which meant bribery, prostitution, gambling, corruption at a very large scale. And in a small country, that becomes destabilizing really quickly. And the linkage between the population, and there were older Chinese populations that had been there for a long time that were very uncomfortable with these newly arrived groups, because the newly arrived groups had linkages through the embassy that the older groups didn't. The older
linkages, like in what sense?
Well, so for example, the first Tongan human trafficking case was a Chinese woman who had brought in 2 other Chinese women, telling them they were going to work in a restaurant. And then she forced them into prostitution to service primarily the Chinese workers that were coming on the big infrastructure projects. And when one of them objected at one point, she was stabbed by one of the Chinese enforcers and ended up at the hospital. And that was how this came out, the situation came out. And her passport had been taken away as soon as the women who had been forced into prostitution, their passports had been taken away. And they knew they couldn't go to the embassy and report it and try to get another passport because the woman who had forced them into prostitution was very good friends with the wife of the ambassador. And when this came to trial, the case came to trial, the embassy provided the translator for the victims and were mistranslating their testimony. And it was only because at this point, so many Tongans have been sent to China to to do their education that Tongans can speak Mandarin and knew that this was not an accurate translation. And so she got a different translator, and the woman was found guilty in this first human trafficking case that Tonga had ever had. So you can see it's not kind of an official linkage, but any of that organized crime activity that China is involved in, or Chinese nationals are involved in, and Grant can talk about this much better than I, almost invariably or always tracks back to the Chinese state in some way or another.
So you started seeing it at the turn of the century as you're traveling through the islands, and you started seeing linkages between Chinese organized crime, the destabilization of these smaller countries, and linkages back to the broader Chinese state.
Yeah, and the patterns were consistent, and which makes sense because the people who are designing those tactics and strategies are the same people. They're the same people sitting in Beijing or in their military academies or their think tanks, and you'll see it manifest in different ways. They have a toolkit, and they might not be using all the same tools in the same location. They'll use whatever works in different locations, but you'll know that they'll try to bribe or compromise immigration department, customs department, policing, education, and what their goals are in each of those is very consistent. And if you're looking at those small countries, you can identify them relatively easily. And then the question is, does that scale? Is this the same in a different? So again, in Tonga, another case in Tonga has military, and a Chinese clinic opened up right opposite the entrance to the barracks. And again, you have Tongans who speak Mandarin, and the Chinese don't think anybody speaks Mandarin. And so there was somebody who is affiliated with them. I'm not going to identify them too precisely, but heard the woman that runs the clinic speaking. And she was, according to what she was saying, she was former PLA. And she was talking about how they could shut down the Tongan economy in a minute if they wanted. And they had deliberately set up opposite the entrance to the barracks so that the soldiers would come to the clinic. And then if you're running a health clinic, you can ask all sorts of personal questions without any problem, and people will answer them. And then you can get information about where they're deploying or how their operations work, things like that. And so then the question is, okay, are they setting up these dual use facilities next to barracks and other locations? We know that a lot of the restaurants in those locations may have prostitution running out of the back. The health clinic thing was a new one for me. But then we saw the Chinese trying to buy GNC. Remember? I don't know if you remember.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
Break that down a little bit. What happened?
So Chinese company tried to buy GNC, which is the, sort of
nutrition company. Yeah.
Which has locations on a lot of bases.
Yeah.
And the concern was that by buying it, were they also buying all of those health files from the military that were going and using GNC? So it's understanding what the Chinese state is trying to do is very complex. And by really understanding how they operate in a small location, then personally, I found it helpful for trying to put together a picture of how far they're willing to go, what the strategies are, what the tactics are. Some of them scale, some of them don't, but it's a starting point for deciphering it.
So that's a good segue into kind of like the crux of the conversation today. And I think, both of you have ample experience, both traveling throughout the islands in Asia and as obviously working in various spheres of government and also in the private sector. But the question I kind of want to launch this is have each of you describe in your own words kind of what I think, Grant, you have a book that's just came out. We're going to talk about this more in detail in a second, but it says the title of the book is called When China Attacks, right? So I want you to describe in kind of your own words, how do you see China's warfare strategy? What does it entail? What is it involved? Now, we know the terms unrestricted warfare. We know three warfares. We know but break that down for us. Make us understand what that actually entails. We could go with Grant first and then Cleo.
Sure. One way to look at it, and it kind of helps me to understand it, is look at how Americans consider a war. We think that it's only happens when people start shooting at each other. And it's almost like a 100-yard dash, where two contestants come up to the line, they shake loose, and then they get in the crouch, and the starter says, shoots the gun, go. And we think at that point, you're at war.
Yeah.
Once the shooting has started, and sometimes you even declare war. But it's when the shooting starts. And before that, we don't think there's war going on. We may not like each other that much, we may have problems, but it's not a war. To an American way of thinking, a Western way of thinking, really. But to the Chinese, the shooting part is only the very end of it. And it's only if necessary. And if you've done everything right in the step in leading up to that, you don't even have to do it, because your enemy is not in a position to defend himself and just kind of has to give up. And when the Chinese look at it, they say they see us as the enemy, and they have for at least 30 years. And they've attacked us on fronts that we don't think of, we don't think of these as how you fight a war. I would suggest, for example, there's economic warfare. You look at how they have Wall Street and the American business class has moved so much of our manufacturing to China. And
Cleo, you're hinting at that and what you're saying with we saw the trends on the island.
In any American city, big city, go into what used to be thriving sort of working class neighborhoods, and these are war zones, full of just drug-addled zombies, basically, just terrible places because the business is gone. It's gone to China. And this is not just by accident. This is a very conscientious thing that Chinese have tried to do, and they've been very successful at it. And this has eroded America's society, but also our military power as well. So there's economic warfare. You have, chemical warfare. And I would say the fentanyl assault, the drugs, most of which come from China originally, that have poured into the United States for years. But speaking just of fentanyl, that a year and a half, it was in 2000, I think the end of 22, it was 77,000 Americans dead.
Yeah.
And that's just from fentanyl. And that's the dead ones. The wounded the numbers are much bigger than that. And this has been going on fentanyl since about 2013, and it's just gone up and up and up, and the numbers are higher this year.
Let me pause you right there. I was asked one question on the fentanyl because it's something that brings up a lot in my conversations, and obviously our audience, I think, is very much into it because it ties to the Mexican cartels. What would you describe as the main linkage between the fentanyl traffickers, which mostly related to the Chinese mafia, and the Chinese government?
Well, as Cleo said, in my experience and others who I listen to, and we've had some dealings with the Chinese organized crime and the Chinese government, is that it always tracks back to some part of the Chinese government. Either the People's Liberation Army, could be customs, could be MSS, the security services, and something into the Chinese Communist Party always does. The so-called triads are really just street toughs, basically. But this is government policy. You have to look at Chinese organized crime as an arm, an element of the party. And otherwise, you just won't understand it. As we tend to think of America, we think of organized crime as almost these independent criminals who are sort of out of the normal society, away from the government. And if the government could, they would get rid of them. But if you look at Chinese organized crime actually as a sort of a part of the government, the enforcement arm, you will understand it. And this does not happen. The flow of drug precursors in particular from China doesn't happen without the approval of the Chinese Communist Party. Okay. And it just couldn't happen. And China will say, well, we don't know. We just don't know. We'd like to crack down. We'd like to help you. But, I would suggest, go to China and go out of your hotel room and draw a mustache on a picture of Xi Jinping and see if the police are waiting for you before you get back to your hotel or 30 seconds after.
It's a vigilant force.
They could stop. This is a surveillance system in China that George Orwell would not have believed. And they could stop it. In fact, when Donald Trump actually asked Xi Jinping about this, she said, well, I don't have a problem. We don't have a problem with drugs. You do.
And I think that's indicative of kind of their posture, because internally within the laws that I understand of how China deals with drug trafficking, it is very strict internally, but it doesn't focus on the external, which is the outflow, both in terms of drugs, fentanyl in that case, the precursors, but also in terms of the money that follows it, that actually allows the industry to be oxygenated through illicit money outflows. And I think China is the number one country for illicit outflows in the world. And so they may be very strict when it comes to within their territory or borders, but they let whatever, kind of like COVID. They might have shut down the flights inside, but they let all the flights go internationally. So that tracks with the way the Chinese Communist Party looks at it.
And from the standpoint of warfare that we're talking about, you see, if you could kill 77,000 of your enemy in a year, and many of these are of military age, people who might serve, it's like taking 2 or 3 divisions off the battlefield. And notice the response, because the Americans think the Chinese can't do anything about it. We don't think we're at war. There is no response. Congress has done nothing. The government has done nothing to make China pay for this. Then you have, of course, cyber attacks on the cyber front, and that's been wildly successful in getting, say, like the blueprints for the F-35 fighter and other sort of very successful hacks of
cyber espionage.
That works very well, but it's not just for military purposes. It's commercial as well, and it's really a full court press, to use the basketball analogy there. So that's been very effective. And there's, you get the media subverted. You can get American media to sort of take the Chinese side of things and to not be too critical. And they've been very successful at that. American academia, it seems the only price to get them was like a business class ticket to a seminar in China. And the promise actually of full tuition paying Chinese students at your schools. But one of the keys to all of this is what I would call proxy warfare.
Yeah.
And this is really the linchpin to Chinese warfare, is to get the elites and influential people in your enemy country to see things China's way. And they have been very successful.
Who then become proxies of China.
Very much. You see when some American companies, for example, try to have the Congress crack down on Chinese trade practices, the illegal Chinese trade practices, American lobbyists will go to work for China to basically force an administration to back down. And you saw this recently in the case of TikTok. Remember, the CEO was testifying before Congress, and you just watched it out of curiosity if he would say anything that was true, which he didn't. But the more interesting part was, if you look behind him, there was a row, a phalanx of Americans, his lobbyists, his lawyers, and he was backing him up and doing China's bidding. And I would suggest Wall Street is in the bag.
Well, that's a great point. Let me dive into that a little bit, because I've often had this argument with a lot of my friends, particularly in Latin America, the area that we work in a lot, because China is obviously evident in Latin America, but they see it as an economic partner. They haven't seen the other dimensions yet, which we know are there and they're coming. But there's this understanding that the bigger threat is the cultural battle, like the wokeism and other things that they're seeing in terms of the attack of traditional values and things like that. And I've always argued that I believe that, in many respects, certain industries that, like, let's take Hollywood, for instance, that tends to project a specific ideology in terms of cultural values. In many respects, they are also subverting to the interests of China and bringing, they're attracted to perhaps the market, they're attracted to perhaps the access, but they end up changing their composition of how they make their messaging to suit China. And China likes that woke ideology because it softens the society. It softens the social fabric of what they would consider an enemy country. It's also polarizing, and so it polarizes the environment. So I said, these aren't necessarily separate issues per se. I mean, they're obviously different conundrums, but China very much likes the United States fighting over gender ideology or whatever social paradigm you can put. Is that characterized right? Would you agree with that, or do you have a different take?
No, that's completely right. That's how the Chinese operate. You want to tear your enemy apart. And if you can do it over things like you've just described, these topics that, they make a society start to see each other as the enemy. You can see the problems it's caused us. The rioting in the streets of so many American cities in 2020. This was actually encouraged and stoked by the Chinese Communist Party. They didn't have to do all that much.
How so?
Support for Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
If you look into this, there has been a Chinese connection to that for a long time.
On like the disinformation front, or maybe on multiple fronts, or is there like a direct link?
Direct link.
Oh, wow.
It's not just saying, hey, this is good, but rather there's direct linkages to it. But that's what you want, is you want your enemy country in turmoil.
Yeah.
And when you're fighting each other, you're not really in a position to defend yourself or to defend your friends overseas. So this is part of the war that the Chinese are fighting, and it does rely on this proxy warfare. You want, and particularly getting the people in your enemy country to do your bidding for you, and they've been immensely successful. I would just cite as an example, in November in San Francisco, when Xi Jinping gave that speech and 400 American executives came and paid a lot to attend and gave him 2 standing ovations. The MC, the master of ceremonies for that event, was actually a former colleague of mine at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. And I remember him saying back then that Mao Zedong would be remembered as a great poet. Nothing about being responsible for 50 million murders. Chinese being killed, but he'd be a great poet. And you listen, if you saw the guy at that, the clips of the event, just fawning. It gives the word fawning a bad meaning.
Is he still in the State Department, or
no? He got out. He works for the.
He lives in San Francisco.
No, he works. He lives on the East Coast, I believe. But he works for. I won't say the name. I don't want to get sued. But he works for an organization.
Okay.
That promotes U.S. and Chinese business.
Okay, and he was at the dinner.
He was the MC.
He was MC.
And so I've generally found that, particularly when it comes to Americans of a certain type, that if you offer some money, just enough money, that they'll respond like a seal at a sea park. Yeah. If you offer them some mackerel, they will perform any trick you want them to do. And it's that lure of the China market.
That's it.
You're going to get fabulously wealthy, and who cares about anything else?
And that was it. The lure, you said it best, the lure of the China market. I mean, I think pretty much all of California was looking at that everywhere from, we talked about Hollywood, but big tech companies, big distribution companies. They all thought that this was going to be the future, that have access to that market. They're going to drive their sales quadruple without any looking on the internal, what's happening in China and how China is actually held up by a house of cards, is not necessarily a strong economic footing. I think that did trick a lot of people, or maybe some people were very vulnerable or very, very willing to be tricked, especially with the carrots.
Well, I think they're an easy target.
Yeah.
And you can always convince yourself that whatever you're doing is right, that it's statesman-like, there's nothing wrong with it if there's money involved in that. And that is ultimately psychological warfare.
Yeah.
Chinese are ultimately aiming to shape the way their enemy thinks.
And that's one of the 3 warfares, right, that they wrote out in the guidelines for the PLA.
That's one of them, but it's part of this multi-front attack that was talking about that happens before any shooting starts. Of course, the Chinese military is building up into a very powerful force, while ours is...
Well, let me then ask the question, in that context of the non-kinetic warfare, how long has China been at war with the United States?
After Tiananmen Square in 1989, the Chinese Communist Party, gave orders to the People's Liberation Army to be able to defeat a country that has aircraft carriers. And that was us.
That's us.
And so you could at least say there, but actually go back to Mao Zedong's day. And that is when
that's
it
when
started.
It's really,
So, but these are 2 systems that cannot coexist. And Xi Jinping has actually said this. And he's not the problem. Because if you look at his predecessors, they were all saying basically the same thing. And just the timing was different. And China had built up enough that they could, when Xi came along, they could sort of expose themselves. But this is nothing new.
Yeah.
So it's been going back really since the 1949, the takeover by the Chinese communists.
Let me pivot to Cleo. Now we talked a lot about the non-kinetic, right? We talked a lot about China's use of pretty much anything, willing in society to weaken, to soften, to debilitate your adversary. I've heard you in other conversations and events that we've been at in panels talk about entropic warfare, right? So describe China's warfare strategy. Obviously, we've touched on a lot of it already, but what other elements would you add to that? And then, if you want to, you can break down the entropic warfare, which I think it's an interesting focus because it talks about debilitating institutions.
Right. So entropic warfare doesn't mean warfare in warm places.
It sounds like it.
It's using the word entropy, and entropy is a state of kind of fragmentation, disintegration, chaos. So you take something that was more or less stable, like a society, and do all of these things that we just spoke about and create this state of fragmentation and weakness, fundamental weakness, which allows the metastasization of the Chinese Communist Party system, which is built around authoritarianism, obviously. So the question really is, we can talk about all the warfares, but what's the goal of all of the warfares, which is, make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, and to replicate that model in a vassal state form. And that's why, as Colonel Newsham was saying, you can't coexist with democracy. Mm. And the idea of winning is very different. You'll hear the term a lot. They want to win without fighting, but the actual translation from the original Mandarin is to get the other side to submit without fighting. Yeah. And submission is a permanent state. So if you take a look at what happened at the end of World War II, for example, and the U.S. beat Japan, and then Japan surrendered, and then the U.S. got to work rebuilding Japan economically and in terms of, and societally and everything like that. I mean, there were obviously changes that were made, but the goal wasn't to get Japan to permanently submit to American will. More, I would argue, and again, Grant would know this better than I, but to make sure that Japan doesn't cause problems for the U.S. and can all kind of grow together economically. If And which is why, as a Marine, if you go to some of the memorials in those Pacific Islands, and there will be memorials to the Americans who fought and died, and to the Japanese. The Americans sort of give that space to the Japanese to have that memorial. Now, the Japanese system is the imperial system. Had they won, I contend there would be no memorials to Americans on any of those locations. A very different psychology. And in the case of if China wins this fight, you have to permanently submit to the Chinese Communist Party. Your way of life is finished, right? You can't.
So it's kind of a permanent presence of war. Like it's relentless.
It's in your head. And this is why control through things like TikTok and things like that, and through social media, but also using the social credit system where you get ranked on your behavior, whether it's the social credit score. Yeah. You can't. During COVID, you literally couldn't cross the street if your phone didn't have a good enough social credit score in the context of your behavior with COVID. And the goal is to export that and to metastasize that to the world, where somebody in Beijing can turn you off, electronically, but possibly in other ways as well, as they're doing with these police stations that they've set up in all these other countries, and to have this permanent state of submission to the point where you self-censor. Because you talked about Hollywood, and there was a great South Park episode that looked at how the Chinese are getting into the heads of the writers of Hollywood. So they're just not writing it. I mean, we used, during the Cold War, you used to be able to say who the enemy was. The enemy was the Soviet Union. Yeah. And when Rocky punched a Soviet guy in the face, everybody cheered, right?
Yeah, Drago.
Yeah. You're not allowed to do that anymore. You're not allowed to say, here's a country that's killed 70,000 people through drug warfare, through chemical warfare, who exported a virus through biological warfare, who's trying to destroy our economies through economic warfare. These are all different chapters in Colonel Newsham's book, by the way. All these different provable attacks, and not only is it difficult to talk about the attacks, but when you put them together as a whole picture and say, these are bad guys, these are people who are really, just if you look in China, the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party are obviously the Chinese people, and if you look at what they've done to people of faith within China, and if you look at people who stood up to the Chinese Communist Party in the Pacific Islands, it's often people of faith. Because for them, the fight between good and evil is much more clear.
It has a spiritual dimension.
Yeah. And they know what's happened to them. In the case of Solomon Islands, for example, one of the provincial leaders there stood up to the Chinese Communist Party, and a big part of it was it was on the basis of freedom of religion.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah. And he explicitly said, because the Chinese Communist Party is systemically atheist, prosecutes people of faith. So that not being able to say they're attacking us, we're at war, and if they win, our lives are permanently altered.
Yeah, especially if you're from the West.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I want to kind of encapsulate.
But not just from India knows it.
Of course.
So we tend to which is 1.4 billion people.
You said something recently when we were at a different event, and you said that, when China started elaborating its warfare strategy, very much had the United States in mind as that adversary. And it's kind of clear when you read Unrestricted Warfare, they kind of reference, the aircraft carriers and things like that. Where did India fall into this? Because it seems like they didn't really think of India as a strategic adversary until more recently. How do you see India play its role within China's warfare strategies in the Indo-Pacific?
India is an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party, because one of the major rationales for the Chinese Communist Party is you can't run a country of over 1 billion people unless you're authoritarian. But inconveniently, right next door, they have a country of over 1 billion people that is providing increasing life expectancy, increasing literacy, growth rates that are better than the West. That's a democracy. So that's a big problem. And it's
kind of hurts the narrative.
Yeah, it hurts the narrative, and it also potentially really hurts them economically if supply chains start to get redirected. India also has a young population with a very high percentage that can speak English, easily integrated into the global economy, very adaptive, work well all over the world, and culturally very welcome. So you go to Pacific Islands and they love Bollywood because you can watch it as a family. Nobody's going to suddenly start doing salacious things that embarrass grandma or whatever, and there's singing and dancing and it's cheerful or action filled or whatever. So that the soft power of India in a lot of the world that isn't the West and isn't China is extremely strong. That's why India's G20 year was very successful. Yeah. And so all of that is a direct threat to the Chinese Communist Party. There is no win-win for the Chinese Communist Party because of this. We've talked about before, this kind of their sense of, for China to be number one, either they get better or they can knock everybody else down, and they're perfectly happy to knock everybody else down. But it's not we all grow together. It's we grow more than everybody else, at least relatively, and we are the middle kingdom. We are what everybody else refers back to.
But did they underestimate India in that regard? Because did they prepare for a rising India? I mean, they put them into BRICS and that kind of thing. But did this figure into their calculation strategically?
So one element of specifically the Chinese Communist Party, which has a very strong core of Han nationalism, is they're racist, and they have been looking at poles of power, and the major poles of power in the late 19th century and early 20th century has been the West, and so they focused very, very much on that. But they have looked down on India. So if you look at unrestricted warfare, as you mentioned in the book, they'll talk a lot about Bismarck or Clausewitz or kind of all that sort of
the Westphalian.
But they don't look at Kautilya, the Arthashastra, which are these 2,000-year-old book of strategy on the Indian side, which is a much more complex view of strategy. So the idea of the enemy's enemy is your friend, that came from Kautilya. But what Kautilya actually has as a graph, it goes out layers and layers and layers. So the enemy's enemy is the friend. If this person is it's 3-dimensional chess. And in fact, the Indians used to have a game which was chess on 3 layers. So that understanding of the complexity of the strategic thought that came out of India, which was, of course, when the British left, there were 500 kingdom or principalities within India. They're used to dealing with strategic complexity. Has been underestimated to a very large degree, not by the Chinese, also by the West, but definitely by the Chinese.
So would it be correct then to say that you see India as a strategic partner of the United States if we want to counter China's efforts at trying to create regional or even global hegemony?
It's a tricky question in the wording because India and the West have the same 2 existential sort of threats. One is obviously the Chinese Communist Party, and the other is extremism. The U.S. has had, and I think this has now changed, this is something we were talking about the other day, but has had the advantage of relative geographic isolation. India has multiple countries on its border, including now China, because they ate Tibet, and Pakistan. So they're both of which would like to destroy them from the inside through entropic warfare, fragment them and create multiple Indias, which are easier to absorb or control. There's often the American, you'll hear American strategists say, well, is India on our side? Why isn't India backing us on X, Y, and Z, or Z if you happen to be Canadian? Whereas from the Indian side, they're saying, you want us to not buy Russian oil because you're having a problem with Ukraine. that will push up our energy prices to the point where, first of all, we're not competitive with China, who will be getting the cheap Russian oil anyways. Second of all, could create famine, and we're a democracy, and our population isn't going to understand why a villager in Assam is going to go hungry because, and this is the way that they frame it, white guys are fighting in Europe, right? So, that's not politically viable for us. What we can do and what they have tried to do is, first of all, say, obviously, Russia, bad to invade a neighbor, don't invade a neighbor. And what they're trying to do with Russia, again, I'm just describing from their point of view, is to give it an alternative to just tying up with China. So if
they're trying to wedge that relationship.
Yeah, and which they think over the longer term will be more beneficial. So that's the Indian logic, but from the logic of some in the US, that means that India isn't reliable. And then the Indians will say, well, how reliable are you if you pull out of Afghanistan and leave tens of billions in weapons to extremist groups who have as their number one target, maybe US, number two might be Israel, and number three is India. And we happen to be the closest. So how reliable are you as a partner? So even though sort of in the very large, writ large strategic trends, the US and India have the same enemies and are working together much, much more closely than they used to. I mean, if you ignore the headlines and just look at what's happening, especially with the Department of Defense in India, the relationship is really growing and deepening, and trust is
institutional.
Building. But this idea that India will be an ally like the UK is just not viable.
The Five Eyes,
But I think that gives them actually more maneuvering room and potential.
And you might not want that. I think you want a country that has its own sovereign will as well. I'm not going to say what this current U.S. government wants, but I'm just saying in general. I think strategically, the United States. One of the challenges that we have, I think, geopolitically, is we're trying to defend our national sovereignty that's being assaulted in many different ways. It's really then encompassed on us to basically help other countries defend their national sovereignty as well. And you don't want to take away their ability to have sovereign will. And so I think it would be a strategic mistake to try to make China become, to make India become something that it's not.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, so Iran very well.
Yeah, of course.
And that's another place where India has better relationships with Iran than many would be comfortable with.
Yeah.
And you also don't want to encourage supporting, horrific regimes.
Yeah, malign activity. Yeah.
But in the case of India, one of the reasons why they maintain that relationship is because they have a very large Shia population, and they're already.
How big is the Shia population in India?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that the overall, they're the second largest Muslim population. And I think that's about 120 or 140 million.
Oh, wow.
So it's a second after Indonesia. And then maybe 10 to 15% of that is Shia.
Normal, yeah.
And they already are dealing with Wahhabi terror problems domestically, and they don't want to deal with Shia terror domestically. So it's a different operating environment, but it's, again, not ideal.
Yeah.
But I have just a quick question. So what we've been describing about this entropic warfare type stuff, do you see that in the areas that you're looking at?
Oh, no, yeah, of course. I think China is a global actor. I think China has an interest and an effort to essentially align what was termed the non-aligned in terms of the G77 countries in the United Nations. And I think in the parts of the world that I look at in Latin America, China's used all the elements of non-kinetic warfare, the economic, psychological, legal, entropic, because Latin America is in a shooting war. It hasn't been in a shooting war they've had conflicts with crime and drugs and cartels and insurgencies, but they haven't had a state-on-state conflict since the War of the Pacific, which happened in the early part of the 20th century. So war to Latin America is a very foreign concept. I mean, World War I, World War II, Latin America wasn't really involved other than providing support to the United States in some regard, but they weren't a theater of operation.
Falklands.
Well, okay, that happened for a little bit and it didn't go very well for Argentina in that regard. So in many respects, I think Latin America doesn't look at war as something that's common in the region. And China capitalized on that because China says we're here for trade, we're here for investment, we're here to build ports, we're here to build infrastructure, we're here to help your telecoms. And Latin America was like, that all sounds great. Let's do it. And not realizing kind of what I think Grant describes in this book and what you've been describing is this is all the part to go to the part where the gun shoots and then the shooting war begins. And I'd argue that we're getting to that point now in Latin America. And Grant, I want to go to you now with a little bit, kind of what we talked a lot about India as role. Let's broaden a little bit the aperture in the Indo-Pacific. What other country you'd say is strategic in terms of our posture, United States posture, in providing a contention on the PRC on China? What would be another country that you would highlight?
Oh, it's Japan.
I would have took a guess, but
yeah, it's that U.S.-Japan relationship which is the key to stability in the region, if not the world. But just take it for the region. And China knows it. And for many years, they thought that they could actually split us. Because it wasn't, nobody would quite admit it, even if they recognized it, was well into the 2000s. Japan was not able to fight a war. It's not even really able now, but it was really defenseless. And instead of building up its defense, it was relying on the Americans entirely for its defense. Yeah. And what China was counting on was be able to say when the time came, send its guys on, onto the Sunday talk shows and up to Capitol Hill and say, look, these Japanese think that they can call you up to come die for you, like you would call a taxi in front of the Hilton Hotel. And that would resonate with a lot of the American public. But we're starting to address that issue. But China was counting on us, politically splitting us.
Like they were counting on the Americans to have more of an isolationist posture? Or
to at least say, that's not a good deal, Japan. Okay. You're on your own. And China could probably take on Japan by itself. But the Chinese don't like it when its enemies get together. And they will do anything to stop it.
How's the U.S.-Japan relationship today?
It's actually pretty good. Yeah. It has gotten better. Well, it's always been okay, been pretty good, but it's never been stressed until China became just an unmistakable enemy, an unmistakable force that was out for no good. And the Japanese realized this starting in the 2010s. And their military has built up more than it was. And you're getting sort of a more equal relationship between us and the Japanese. And it was that unequal relationship that some of us identified and thought we would do something about. And that was what was behind the Amphibious effort, really.
Okay, yeah.
So you put these two countries together.
You were helping them get prepared for what potentially could come down the horizon?
Yes, we weren't allowed to say it.
Okay.
In fact, I'd have been fired if I had actually said that. You couldn't say it at the time, but there were plenty of Japanese who saw the China threat.
Yeah.
And, we of course saw it. And that's why we did something about it. But what you're doing is you're putting, more equality into the relationship because it was so out of whack where the Americans were really underwriting Japan's defense. But it was once that threat came along that Japan started to wake up and even the Americans started to wake up as well. Really it's Japan's size and its military capabilities and potential capabilities and its economic power. And also it's seen in Asia as a nice alternative to China. The World War II was much less of an issue outside of China and Korea. Throughout Asia, it's really not much of an issue at all. But so you combine the Americans with the Japanese, and that's a formidable force. And most Asians, once again, outside of the Chinese Communist Party and some Koreans, most Asians are happy to see a solid U.S.-Japan alliance. And there's other countries which are glad to sort of get into that, like Australia, of course, plays a role. The Philippines does as well. Taiwan and even South Korea.
So here we have a map, courtesy of FDD and courtesy, I'm sure, of the work of Cleo, who's a senior fellow there. Now, let's talk a little about Taiwan. I mean, this is the big conversation. They had the election earlier this year, and it was clear to me that Taiwan's taken a position that they want to try to maintain their sovereignty from the mainland China. Describe the scenarios, and we'll start with Cleo first, then we'll go to Grant. Describe the scenarios of what would China's approach be to invading Taiwan? How would that look like in terms of the region, in terms of everything that we described about China's warfare?
Okay, so I'll just explain the geography a little bit, because there's a sense often that the center of the Pacific is empty. But the way that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea works is every island gets a 200 nautical mile zone around it, an exclusive economic zone. So countries that may seem like they have a small population or small landmass actually have oversight to some degree over very large areas. So one of them, I don't need to share on the map, but Kiribati has a population of about 120,000, but it actually covers as much of the ocean as India would if it was spread out over the ocean. These are very large areas. The other thing is that the United States is a Pacific Island country. It has location. So everything that's dark blue here is U.S. territory. So you've got Guam over there. I don't know if you can probably reach it. I can't. There's Guam. Right north of Guam is the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. That's where the U.S. shares a border with Japan. I mean, that's a good bar bet if you ever want to, win off anybody. Does the U.S. share a border with Japan? Yes, it does. And then there are all of these others, including American Samoa. So the U.S. is there. It's in the Pacific, and it's quite far towards the coast of Asia. And then you've got these three lighter blue countries, Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, that are independent countries. But they have what's called a compact of free association with the U.S., which is up for renewal. We can talk about it later if you want, which gives the U.S. exclusive military access to the air and sea and to a very large degree land. So that's allowed this kind of...
In Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, they have a compact of free association.
That's right. So they're independent countries, but the U.S. has the responsibility to protect them from any threats or attacks, and they can block any other military's access into the country. And they can put in bases. So there's a base in the Marshall Islands, Kwajalein Ronald Reagan Missile Test Site is there. They're putting in an over-the-horizon radar installation in Palau, which abuts the Philippines. So this constellation, the U.S. possessions in combination with the freely associated states, these compact states, allows the U.S. to push its defense perimeter all the way out to the maritime boundary of Japan and the Philippines. Now, looking at it from the Chinese side, if you're standing on the coast of China, what you see is a string of islands from Japan through Taiwan, down through the Philippines, down through kind of Borneo, Malaysia, that blocks you in. So there are only a few channels you can get your subs out. You have to overfly your planes. And Japan and Korea are treaty allies, as is the Philippines of the United States. So this hems that's called the first island chain. That first island chain really hems in China from a Chinese perspective. And these islands, the U.S. islands and the freely associated states, allows this power projection corridor to reinforce that first island chain. And then there's a second island chain that goes down through Guam, a little bit off the coast. So if you're looking from a kinetic perspective currently, if you combine the U.S. possessions and the freely associated states and the treaty allies along the first and second island chain, it kind of looks like you have it locked down. But because of the political warfare stuff that's happening within the countries, and which is where the actual war is being fought
within
now.
These compact countries.
Within all of them.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about, for example, C.N.M.I, which is part of the U.S., just north of Guam, had a casino, Chinese-linked casino there, that was running more money through it than the casinos in Macau.
Oh, wow.
So if you're talking about illicit money flows, it's highly likely that those casinos on U.S. soil, but in a location in the U.S. where Chinese can arrive without a visa. Chinese can just get on a plane and land in the U.S. in C.N.M.I. and then run the money through those casinos and launder it in a way that has completely distorted the economics.
So China is engaged in proxy warfare in all these countries.
That's right.
And is degrading and polarizing and debilitating them from within.
That's right. And Grant is better than I am about talking about sort of how that would play out in the case of warfare.
Well, Grant, what do you see when you look at this map? How do you see China's strategic positioning, and how do you see they would invade Taiwan, or what would be the scenarios post the invasion?
Yeah, one of the sort of good ways to look at it that was just described is that first island chain. And you'll notice that the American presence in Asia is mostly concentrated on some bases in Japan and in South Korea. That's where the bulk of it is. And you see, that's way up to the northeast. Yeah. Lately, we have made some very good moves to get into the Philippines and be able to put some rotate forces in there. And the Philippines has been very cooperative of that, or the administration has. And so that's allowing us to spread out a bit. Also, we have a presence in northern Australia, way down to the south. And then the Marines have just opened a base on Guam. And the Air Force is doing a much better job of getting ready to operate throughout the region. They're trying to find every airfield they can find anywhere. The idea being if you spread out, you have a better chance of survival, but you also have better opportunities if you go on the offensive, because you can come from a lot of different directions. But that's the American military presence. And you'll notice that for too long, we focused on the western edge of the Pacific. We didn't pay attention to the middle
Pacific, yeah.
And so that is why the three states, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, the three nations, and Marshall Islands, are in play. Because we're not there. We left an opening, vacuums get filled, and the Chinese have filled it using this sequence of commercial presence, which leads to political influence, all greased with bribery.
What we were talking about before. Yeah.
And it's a sequence. You can see it play out, not just in the Pacific, but everywhere.
Yeah.
And the third step, there's always a security military end of it. But the Chinese are very patient with that, and they'll settle for the first two for as long as it takes to soften up the society, to create a constituency which sees China as the better bet, or that is just making money from China. And even in countries that we think are our old friends who love us, and they kind of do, the Chinese have been very successful. And
does China have military presence in any of these three? Not yet.
Not yet, but they.
Well, it depends on whether you include like signals intelligence and things like that for military.
So they have an intelligence presence.
They do have the Chinese spies are all over the place. And there's obviously, if you have commercial access to a place with a little imagination, you can set up listening posts, et cetera. And Guam has really been the victim of that. And sort of everybody knows it, but nobody will do anything about it. But Chinese survey ships have been scouting out these undersea cables between some of these islands, and also doing the kind of research survey you need to do for submarine operations. One thing at a time, but they've been very slow or gradual about an overt presence, say with the Chinese Navy showing up. But you find it most recently in the Solomon Islands, where the government signed a deal allowing the Chinese police to come in, and also potentially allowing the Chinese military to come in to look after Chinese interests.
And that started with all commercial projects.
Exactly. It's that sequence.
That was a big lesson because what happened in the Solomon Islands, what happened relatively recently, was a big lesson that we use to help explain Latin America that this is coming, right? Because they have over 40 port infrastructure projects, and Latin Americans look at that as just an investment to help develop shipping. But the Solomon Islands showed that in those agreements, if you read the fine print, they don't discard the use of military training, military deployments, military logistical forward operating locations, because they know that that's eventually where they want to bring it. And then ironically, the biggest port project that they have in Latin America is on the is in the Pacific, and it's in the country Peru. It's called the Costco Shipping is the company, and it's a mega port that's going to have the capacity to receive triple E class shipping vessels, which are also about the same size of an aircraft carrier. And so that's going to come online this year. And then when they look at the fine print, it actually mentioned military training, like they can be an offshoot for military vessels. So Xi Jinping is supposed to show up in November into Peru to inaugurate this new mega port that's coming in a city called Chancay off the coast of Lima. North of Lima.
And part of that Solomon's thing was that, as Grant said, is explicitly in the agreement, is that they can go in to protect Chinese civilians and major projects. Right. So because often there's the problem with this map is Latin America isn't here. Right. So
the problem with everybody's map.
Because, for example, if you see where it says France, France is a big player in the Pacific. That's French Polynesia. And the Chinese were overtly saying they wanted to use French Polynesia as a transshipment point to South America in particular. So this map, this is a map of the highway between China and Latin America. So the Pacific Islands matter to a lot.
And this is the shortcut.
That's the shortcut if you're going across the top, and then but you need to get past that first island chain anyway, and through the second island chain, and then down around through here. So you might not think of it if you're in Peru, but Solomon Islands or even France can matter to your security if that's going to be a power projection point for the Chinese to get closer to you in order to be able to deploy. But can I ask Grant a question?
Yeah, sure.
Because we know that the Chinese are using a lot of criminal activity to advance their interests. And the question is, what linkage, if any, is there between the Yakuza and the Chinese? And is the Yakuza involved in any kind of foreign policy engagement from Japan or from any other interests?
The Yakuza don't operate the way the Chinese criminals do. The Japanese government doesn't see it that way. There are connections, of course, between Chinese organized crime and Japanese in China, for example. Once I saw a list of the Chinese translations or the names for the Japanese gangs. And you do find Yakuza anywhere that there are Japanese businesses. But there's not a great deal of what I would call a really synergy. Worrisome connection. You do find it between the Japanese Yakuza and the Taiwanese gangs. So there is this connection, but I don't quite, it doesn't seem as sort of government directed as you have with China. A couple of things to mention about what we've just been talking about is the Chinese objective is to have a military that can operate globally. They've said that. They've been very clear about it. And to have that, you need the infrastructure. And that is the ports, the airfields, and also friendly governments that will let you in. And you saw this play out in Djibouti. And remember that the Chinese swore this was not true, swore they had no military intentions. And then one day they said, oh, yeah, we did. And now you have a Chinese regiment in Djibouti. And
that's another big lesson.
But it is a sequence that invariably plays out. And they want to be able to operate globally like the Americans can. But we're talking about, ultimately, when we talk about kinetic warfare, one thing that to keep in mind, and we've been discussing it, is you really want this free access in the Central Pacific, if not everywhere. And we tend to assume we have it because we have a treaty, but with these three countries that gives us these rights. But remember in Puerto Rico, with Vieques, when Puerto Rico said, we don't want you here. And the American military had to stop using that base. So this is the potential, is that some of these countries that we think are our friends and, just tell us, look, we like you, but we don't want the military here.
No, there's a huge parallel between this map and the Caribbean, where there's a lot of, there's independent sovereign nation states, but there's also a lot of territories. And then there's also a lot of kind of cooperative republics that have alliances. And I think China has been studying that very closely, of how the Caribbean countries, how they're, basically the same type of proxy warfare. They, fund the elites, and they kind of position them against one another. Grant, let me plug your book, because I'm going to be looking forward to reading this very, very soon. And I could tell by our conversation that the title is a bit of it's kind of a trick question, right? Of when China attacks, and I think the answer is they've already been attacking. But tell me about your motivation for writing the book. I know it came out very recently. It's available now on Amazon?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're going to put the link for anyone that wants to buy the book in the show notes. Just go in the description of the video. We'll put the Grant's book available for those that want to purchase it. But just to end a little bit of our conversation, tell us what motivated you to write this book, and what you want readers to take away, and even policymakers to take away from reading it.
Well, I wrote it because a publisher asked me to write it.
Okay, well, that's the easy to explain.
If I'd had any idea how much work it was,
you might have said no.
I might have, but it was nice to be asked. Yeah. But I've been, I guess, involved with China since about 1980. So 40 plus years. And this is sort of my take on China. Yeah. And particularly sort of what the problem, how we got in the mess we are in, and what the problems are, and what to do about it. So I try to explain this for the readers who are interested in the subject but may not live and breathe it.
So this is written for a lay audience?
Oh, very much.
Okay.
And that's who I write for anyway.
Okay.
And it's very much written for, it's called regular people. Yeah. It's not for the 12 people in DC think tanks who will look at the footnotes, see if they're in there, and then close it. But it is written, it's if I sat down and talked to somebody and they said, well, what I need to know about China, well, this is it. And I go through the chain of events and the way that we got into this position where China could potentially defeat us. Yeah. And also, once again, how to go about it. And you're right, the title is a trick question. The point being they already have. Mm-hmm. And the subtitle is a warning to America, but it's actually a warning to free people everywhere. Yeah. And it does use a lot of examples that are not American examples. So I think anyone who reads it is going to see some things that look pretty familiar about it.
This is good. And so again, we're gonna put it in our show notes. We're gonna promote it. I'm looking forward to reading it. I think we're going to see each other soon in another seminar. So I'm going to actually read on the way to the seminar. So I'll be fully informed. And Cleo, do you have a book? When's your book coming out? I know you write all the time, and I don't want to put any pressure on you. I don't know if the publisher is going to call you next. But Cleo, you have a wealth of knowledge to put in a book at some point.
Yeah, I wrote a book about 15 years ago, and it scarred me. So I have no interest in doing another book. But and also, I have to say that I've been really enjoying getting information from the way you do information.
Oh yeah,
the podcast, but also your visuals are great.
Yeah,
your teams have been doing great graphics, and in fact, Grant used some of your graphics.
I did, in fact.
Oh, very nice, very nice.
Yeah.
We're pleased to hear that. But yeah, I kind of, we didn't really even get into this. This is going to be like a part 2 for the conversation. Is I think artificial intelligence is going to become that has the potential to be what they call the revolution of military affairs. It has the potential to take us into that 5th generation of warfare. And if it is, then we need to get really good at the digital era. We are in it. We're all immersed in it. I think COVID made sure that we all knew that it was there. And I think if you're not familiar with digital applications, everything from social media to just, the way you ebooks and things like that, I think in 10, 15 years, it's almost like being illiterate. You won't be able to communicate. You won't be able to receive information. And I think that's something that, at the think tank level, we're very slow at adapting to it, and I think a lot of think tanks are still like with the policy report, and it's good for the policy class that reads your everyday. They'll read a book if it's written in a way that's easy to understand, but they'll also just look at a graphic and then kind of interpret the graphic. So that's kind of our thinking on that. But I want to thank you guys first. I want to make sure that everyone knows where they can follow you. I know you guys are on X and social media. How do people follow your work?
Yeah, I'm on X with it's just my name, Cleo Paskal. Yeah. And thank you for the whiskey.
Is that what that was? I thought that was green tea. They lied to me. But okay, you're on X. Obviously, you can find you on FDD. Yeah. You write for the Sunday Guardian.
I do. And this is something that I actually would recommend is to read some of the Indian media.
Okay.
Because they're very clear-eyed, especially if you're interested in China. They were attacked by China in 2020. They had 20 of their soldiers killed by the PLA.
Break that down a little, because that's a very interesting story. We didn't touch on it here, but maybe we could, in like 2 minutes or so, give us the synopsis.
So there's been China invaded and took over Tibet in the 50s. And that had always been the buffer state between India and China. India and China didn't have a border. That this created the border. And China has been pushing and pushing and pushing on the Indian side for a long time. And they had a war in 1962. And China used the Cuban Missile Crisis as a cover for that attack. So they got buyout from the Soviet Union to be able to do it. And the U.S. was distracted. And as soon as the Cuban Missile...
So while we were looking at the Soviets in Cuba, they took over Tibet.
No, they had already taken over Tibet, and they used their position there to go deep into Indian territory. Okay. And then as the Cuban Missile Crisis resolved, they pulled out quite a bit. But this is relevant because it's an example of, we've been talking before about how all these fires are starting in Gaza and Ukraine or whatever, and how China has in history used a cover of another incident to do something that it wanted in a different location when there was less attention paid to it. Yeah. But then in 2020, they did that same push, and they ambushed a group of Indians and killed the commanding officer. And I think they thought that the Indian would scatter. They were projecting. I think that in the case of China, maybe you kill the commanding officer and the soldiers will run. In the case of India, the ties with the commanding officer are almost filial, and they regroup and counterattacked. And the best estimates are about 45 PLA were killed. And we know about 20 Indians were killed. But that was the moment.
45 PLA official?
There's no official, because the Chinese have only ever acknowledged 4 deaths. So imagine how great it is to be a member of the PLA and your death is an embarrassment. Yeah, that's right. Whereas on the Indian side, they all had very public military burials, and the whole country grieved. And it was a turning point for India, where suddenly every Indian knew who their enemy was.
So China saw this as an embarrassment then?
It was a big mistake, and the 2 weeks later, the big Indian counterattack was to ban 59 Chinese apps, including TikTok and WeChat, because they knew how to hit them in this unrestricted warfare counterattack. So that fundamentally changed the way that India looks at China. And so if you look at the Indian media now, they're much better at reporting about Chinese activities in all of Asia, but also their view of the U.S. is more complex, and it's a good way of triangulating global news reporting.
No, and I think it's also a good example of how China's good when it's on the offensive, but when there's a counteroffensive, it rattles them at times, and that was what I think that incident 2020 kind of illustrated. Yeah. And then Grant, where can we find you? Are you also on social media? I know obviously there's the book, but is there other ways to follow your work and your writings?
Yes, I've got a sort of a website that tracks to the stuff I write. Okay. And I do write a fair amount. It's www.grantnewsham.com. And I am on X at Newsham Grant.
At Newsham Grant.
And also I'm with the Center for Security Policy.
Yeah, that's a good
on their website. You can find just about everything I do.
That's a great think tank. Center for Security Policy, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, 2 excellent think tanks, but 2 excellent scholars. It's been a privilege to talk to you guys. I think you guys have some of the smartest minds on looking at China, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but China globally. There's a lot of lessons. I love to bring you guys to Latin America so you can help explain to them a little bit of how this strategy unfolds, because that conflict, which is slowly bubbling up, will impact the United States probably more than others because of just geographic proximity. And I think China realized over time that they were going to diminish their geographic disadvantage inevitably by putting proxy warfare into Latin America. The Latin Americans don't all see it yet, but it's coming and it's happening very quick. And obviously I think that for the United States is going to be a problem that we're going to have to address. So thank you again. We look forward to having you guys back at some point. And Grant, I know you're not always in DC, so hopefully the next time you come to DC, give me a call and we'll do this again. For those that are new to the podcast, be sure to subscribe by hitting the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to be able to follow all notifications. You get updated when we have great guests like Grant and Cleo. And if you follow us on other digital platforms, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, or whatever, just be sure to subscribe there as well. And put comments and likes. And I'd say give us at least 1,000 likes to this video. And we will be giving a copy of Grant's When China Attacks to one of the members that gives a comment on this video. So be sure to comment, ask questions, we'll respond, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next podcast.
Subscribe to the Border Wars Podcast and visit our website at securefreesociety.org. See you in the next episode.